Hi, this is Max Martin from MovementScreen, and I wanted to use this opportunity to take you through the results that you will get once you've collected all the information through the screening and assessment process with a client so that you can better understand what are the outputs of the MovementScreen software. So what do the results actually mean? Now, this is the first of the results screen that we get to once you have done all the tests down the right-hand side. So the medical screening, the physical activity capture, the disability assessment, posture, and all the movements that you have assessed and screened. So once we've done those, this is the first of the output or result screens that we get to. Now we've placed this one first, the injury risk and hotspots, because obviously the first thing that we're trying to do is screen the client for risk of injury once they start an exercise program. So on the left hand side, you actually see the injury risk score that the client has received. And this is based on a number of different inputs, including the BMI that's calculated at the top of the medical screen, so where we take the height and the weight or the mass. From the physical activity levels, now this one's blank at the moment, but we know that someone that is less physically active, more sedentary, is more likely to get injured once they commence an exercise program. And in going back to the BMI, we know that someone with a greater BMI, assuming that that is coming from excess adiposity, is more likely to also get injured as they start a physical activity program. From the posture side of things, information from the analysis, the degrees of tilt are also included in that physical activity, in that injury risk. Then obviously from the movements, this is really where it's most heavily weighted as it goes into that injury risk. The logic here being that if someone doesn't move well in performing these gym-based, exercise-based movements without any load, without any fatigue, then as we start to load them up and fatigue them, they're much more likely to become injured. So as we come back to this screen here, it's really important to understand that all the values that contribute to that injury risk, all the data that goes in is based on evidence. There is good amounts of research-based evidence that all of those components affect injury risk. And the way that we term, for example, in this case, that 74%, is this is the chance that someone is likely to get injured within the first 3 months of their training if we don't consider their specific needs. Now, why the first 3 months? Because most of the evidence points that injuries are at greater risk when someone is commencing an exercise program in the early stages of their exercise program, because they haven't learned to modify the degree of exercise well. If they're following a program, they may not know their own intensities, their body's not used to the movements, and so on and so on. Then we move on to the hotspots. Now the hotspots are basically showing us which joints are at greater risk of injury, and these are indicated through this almost traffic light system of dots are the different joints, where no dot means a low risk of injury for that joint based on the information collected, then a yellow, orange, and red. Now, the way that we arrive at these hotspots is if we go back to the movement questions, for example, and we look at the squat, each of the questions relates to function at certain joints. So for example, if we look at the last question here with the squat, the knees in line with the feet. So if the knees are not in line with the feet, we know that that's likely to place the knee at greater risk of injury primarily, but then also that the ankle and the hip are also going to be involved in that. They're likely to not be functioning perfectly, and so they are also going to be at a greater risk of injury. So that's one of the bits of data that goes in towards calculating those hotspots. But the other thing is that different questions in different movements or exercises here are weighted more heavily for injury at certain areas. So what do I mean? So for example, let's take the squat. If I say to you, look, this morning I was squatting really, really heavy and I hurt myself. Where did I hurt myself? chances are that you might think, well, potentially the most common places would be your lower back or your knees. And the evidence supports this, that the more likely spots for injury in a squat are the lower back and the knees. So in this case, where the lower back has a red mark against it, so the client couldn't maintain neutral lumbar position, and the knees, they couldn't maintain their knees in line with their feet, those two questions are going to be weighted more heavily, towards injury risk, but also at coming up as a hotspot in the results screen here. Okay, so for example, if we change this and added a second two injuries, we can see if someone, for example, if the thighs don't reach the horizontal plane, now that's telling us something perhaps about their mobility and their strength, but they're not necessarily going to get injured because they don't squat deep enough. It may mean something down the track, but it's not a high risk of injury. So that is how those hotspots are calculated. Now, obviously, if it only happens in one of the movements, so for example, this client couldn't maintain a neutral lumbar position in the squat, but then they do in all the other movements, so for example, they're okay in the lunge, they're okay in the deadlift, then that score will be diluted down. So it won't be as relevant, and the lower back is less likely to come up as a hotspot. If obviously that's present across a number of movements, then the score starts to become much bigger. Okay, so that talks to us about this screen. If we go to the individual movement scores, basically we know that these are made up, the averages in green there are made up of both the questions answered, so for example the yes, no, red, green questions here, and the movement slider, and those two scores are worked together to give us our movement scores here. Those movements that have a left and a right, obviously we see the two separate scores there, and then we obtain an average for that movement, and then an average down the bottom for all the movements together. If we move on to our disability assessment score, you can see the WHO disability score in this case from the answers that we obtained from here. The client has a score of 10, which we can rank against a percentile rank against age-specific members of the population. So that places this individual in the worst 9% for disability. That's what that graph means. So the further to the left that yellow dot is, the greater the level of disability compared to age-specific members of the population. Okay, as we move on to the capacities, these capacities are collected. So here we're looking at overall capacities for that individual. So overall symmetry score of right versus left scores from the movements that we assessed. Balance is obtained, and it's a whole body score that we get, so we don't break it down by joints. And it's indicated or affected primarily by the questions that directly assess balance. So for example, in the lunge, the bottom question is balance maintained. In the single-legged squat, the last question is balance maintained, but it's also affected by the degree of rotation in the 4-point test. So that's balance. Stability, mobility, and strength are determined from the scores of individual movements. So let me give you an example. For example, all movements are weighted for different capacities. So for example, if we look at an overhead reach, you can see that this movement is primarily looking at mobility, range of motion, and range of motion of the shoulder specifically. But the whole movement is scored quite heavily for mobility. However, once we go on to a 4-point, the 4-point is more about stability and also stability of the shoulders. So that movement is weighted more heavily for stability and more heavily weighted for stability of the shoulders. When we look at the push-up, then we're looking at more strength. Of course, stability is important, both stability of the shoulders and the trunk, but it's weighted more heavily for strength. So once we go and have a look at our capacities here, those scores are reflected here. One of the things that you will note is that typically stability and mobility score quite similarly to each other. And this is one of the things that actually we found once we were testing the algorithms and the logic behind it, which actually worked very well, is that if someone's relatively unstable, they will tend to tighten up. It's a natural response of the body to tighten up around that unstable joint to protect it. So degrees of stability or instability are matched by degrees of mobility or tightness around that instability. But then much more valuable, so this gives us an overall picture of that individual, what's the greater capacity that we need to focus on with that individual. But then from there, we can start to break it down in our correctives to those capacities per joint complex. So the symmetry and the balance scores are carried over from the overall capacities. As we mentioned, they are whole body measures really. So symmetry of 77, balance of 73 is what we're seeing here. Symmetry of 77 at the top, balance of 73, but then the other three capacities are broken down by joint. So how do we do that? Well, each of the questions in our movements are also weighted for the type of capacities that affect them. So for example, if we look at knees in line with feet, if the knees are not in line with the feet, that starts to affect the stability of the knees. But it also, and typically if we look at, if we asked, okay, why would someone not be able to keep the knees in line with the feet other than just a technique issue, other than the fact that they don't know how to do it? We can start to look at, okay, the common reasons, and obviously there's going to be many, but the most common reasons would be lack of ankle dorsiflexion, so tightness or stiffness in the ankles, or lack of mobility in the ankles, and lack of stability in the hips. So someone that continuously has knee alignment issues during their assessments is going to likely score mobility issues in the ankles here, which obviously this client doesn't, so that wasn't the case for the data that we put in, and stability issues in the hips, which in this case, for example, this client does. So, for example, like we were talking about, if someone scores quite badly here, they're going to suffer in their overall mobility score, but also mobility of the shoulders. If they score poorly here, they're going to score poorly, or the stability score is going to be reduced, but primarily the shoulder stability. If they score poorly for the push-up, then the overall strength score is going to decrease, but primarily the shoulder strength score is going to decrease, which is, for example, what we see here. Now, we only highlight the worst three areas, but we also have cutoffs for the scores. So at the number 1, you will see the worst joint complex that requires that capacity. So for example, for the stability, we see that this client needs core stability more than anything else. Then they need hip stability, and you can see that we have a 2 and a 3, so they're ranked in order. So they need more stability on the left hip than the right hip, as indicated by the movement scores. When we look at the mobility, not one body area was very, very bad at mobility. So there is no one. And this allows you to just get an estimation of how serious the issue is for them. They do, however, need mobility at both hips, and both the same because they're both rated as a 2. When we go to strength, only one of them showed a significant score for strength issues, and also at the shoulders, and both sides the same. So there you go. That's how we actually can get the best amount of information out of the outputs, educate ourselves as professionals, and educate our clients as to why it is that we're doing the exercises that we're doing with them, and to encourage them and to try and improve those scores. This is one of the things that we find is that clients love, by and large, they love numbers, they love scores, and they love to see those scores improving. So if we can, for example, start to change these scores here and use them as motivation for them to do the homework exercises, the stability exercises, the mobility work, the foam rolling, the soft tissue work, which is often the more boring side of things that clients don't want to do, here we're giving them some good motivation. And then obviously we can go to our client report, which we can print for them, and they get all this information in PDF format that can be emailed to them. And there is descriptions for each of the physical capacities and exercises here that are just example exercises that they can do to address each of their specific needs. Now, for you to be aware, we basically rank the exercises that we provide here. They're example exercises, but obviously they are selected by their capacity. So, for example, if we look at that top one, their stability, but then also by the joint complex that the client needs it for. So in this case, stability, both for the core and for the hips, and they're ranked according to the score that they got. So if the client got a really bad score, they're going to get very simple ground-based movements. In this case, for example, the scores weren't too bad for stability because we're using a hip lift. So that's a little bit more complex than, for example, just the core activation and some leg loads or dead bugs, that type of exercise. And then for the hip stability, we're doing single leg hip lifts, as opposed to just a hip extension exercise or a hip abduction exercise, open chain, ground-based, which would be a much simpler, easier exercise for the client to start to develop their capacity. So again, just some sample exercises there that give you an idea. And in the help file, you have 80 odd exercises that we use to actually generate this list here. So you can always refer back to those, and they give you the definitions for each of the exercises. I hope you found that useful, and that we can help to educate our clients better. I look forward to chatting to you again soon.